Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance. The CFO role is changing rapidly, moving from cost controller to strategic visionary. And with every change comes opportunity. We are here to help you take advantage of this transition, to win at work, drive your career forwards, and lead with confidence. Join Hannah Munro, Managing Director of ITAS, a financial transformation consultancy, as she interviews key experts to give you real-world advice and guidance on how to transform your processes, people, and data. Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance.
So hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. I am your host as usual, Hannah Munro, and with me today is Mark Blakemore. Now Mark is the CFO at Compleat Software, one of the partners we actually work with, as we were just discussing before starting this podcast. So welcome Mark, great to have you on the show.
Great to be here. Thank you very much indeed.
So, let's start with a little bit about what was your journey to CFO? How did you get into that first CFO role that you had?
Oh, goodness. Well, I've been in finance for now over 30 years, so it depends how far you want to go back. I had a background in audit with Touche Ross, as was. They later became Deloitte. Then went to work in a startup telco for a few years called Torch. Then graduated to become the group financial controller at Kingston in 1999. So learned a lot about the kind of the PLC environment there. And then in 2004, left to become the CFO at a company called Program Management Group, which dealt in program management software. So I kind of left telcos at that stage and went into software, and I've been in software ever since. And did that for 3 years at the same time, then migrated to a company called Magenta, which does logistics scheduling software, with many of the people there based out in Russia. Stayed there for 10 years, and then in 2018 joined Compleat, where I currently am.
And was the shift into SaaS at that first role, program management, was that an intentional shift, or was it how did you get that first role as CFO?
Actually, that wasn't a SaaS company. That was in 2004. It was software in the old way of doing things, where you just sold perpetual licenses and then just upsold maintenance off the back of that, or other consulting revenues. So I didn't actually start in SaaS until 2011, when I was at Magenta, when my CEO approached me and said, look, the world as we know it has changed thanks to the banking crisis in 2009, that the market for big ticket software development, where you get $1 million or £1.5 million contracts and you build something completely bespoke and then maintain it for many years, that was dying. And my CEO approached me and said, we need to change here. We need to adopt this new regime. And we looked at what our recurring revenue base was at that time, and it was £2,000 a month. I was like, oh, we've got a bit of a problem. And the problem with SaaS is that it consumes cash. And especially when you're starting at a base of just £2,000 revenue stream, it was very difficult. So over time, over 7 years, we changed that from £2,000 a month to over £200,000 a month of recurring revenues, alongside other long-standing contracts or other perpetual revenue streams that we had at that time. So it's a very difficult process when you're migrating from a big ticket model to a SaaS model, where your cash constraints and problems are very acute at times.
Yeah, and I guess, this is obviously the second SaaS company that you've been with. How do you manage that cash, that runway? How do you approach making sure that you find the balance between growth, I guess, and ensuring that the company keeps operating?
Two-word answer: very carefully, I suppose. Cash is absolutely king, especially in a small startup or scale up. And The key thing is about getting your projections right. It's managing. The one thing you can control is your cost base. You can control how many people you hire. You can control to an extent the salaries that they earn. And 80 to 85% of the costs that SaaS companies typically incur is people costs.
Mhm.
So if you know your people and you're growing that organically over time as and when you can afford it, that's the key development. So the key is in forecasting. If you know what your costs are, then you're really sort of looking at where my sales going to come from, what's the other side of the equation, and how accurately can I forecast that. And often the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So you're forecasting based on what you've done in the past, but also where you think your growth potential could be. Um, I'd love to say that I've used some of the big ticket forecasting software that is out there in FPA software. I haven't. I've just used a lot of very good Excel models that I've developed over time. Um, so providing you know your cash constraints and you're then layering on your sales forecasts over the top of that, that's the critical thing. And then having very detailed and long discussions with your investors so that you know when your cash constraints are going to come, when you're going to run out of money and when you're going to need some fresh money coming in. And the critical thing that investors don't want is nasty surprises. So it's incumbent upon you to ensure that you can forecast, and I've done it even down to the nearest day when I know I'm going to run out of cash, and be that for 3 6 months in advance, and relaying that to your investor base and ensuring that they know so there's no surprises there.
And we talked a little bit about cash being an incredibly, I guess, both challenging and important aspect of being a SaaS CFO. What else do you think is, I guess, is particularly important for SaaS CFOs?
It's knowing when to push the levers in growth. Because the SaaS model is very much predicated around the fact that if you gain a kind of a virtuous circle, then you continue to invest in sales and marketing and it spouts out more. The converse is true that if you then expand too quickly and your salespeople either don't work out or you go into markets where your growth isn't as quick or you hire the wrong people in those markets, and hands up if other the companies that I've been in, we've made some of those mistakes and we've gone too aggressive too quickly, and it's knowing then when to rein back in. So it's the growth really. You've got to get, assuming you can get your development right, and you've got an engineering arm who can bring out good code, and your software is proven to be best in class. The then challenge is when to push the levers in sales and marketing.
And I guess, you've been doing this, you've been working in SaaS for a very long time. How do you find that judgment point? Like, what are some of the things that you look for to know, whether to push that lever or to pull it back?
Within marketing, you have to find a vein of return from those marketing events. And you've probably heard the old marketing adage that uh, half the marketing expenditure I put my money into is useless and gives me no return at all. The problem is I don't know which half. And it's finding those veins where you strike a bit of gold
Yeah.
and you mine those for all you can. It's the same with salespeople to an extent. You find you would recruit an SDR or an AE who doesn't work out and knowing then when to cut bait on those people. Conversely, you point somebody who turns out to be great, gets the product, is engaging and hits their targets. And okay, this is the mold. Then we then find another person who mirrors that person to mine that same vein.
And do you know what's really interesting is that when we're talking about SaaS CFOs, but actually a lot of what we're talking about here is resource management within sales and marketing as well. So how involved are you in those areas? How do you work with your counterparts in sales and marketing to support those growth levers?
Very closely, especially in small startups and scale-ups, which is what I've been involved in. And I do like the small company environment. It's where I feel comfortable. I feel like I can add a lot of value. And it harkens back to those early startup days that I had at Torch and what I enjoyed the most. Hence why I've stayed in the small company environment for most of my career, really. You have to have a a close working relationship with those people and with all people within the company. Part of the joys of working in a small company is they don't do politics, they don't do egos, and that's kind of refreshing. And I've worked in large companies. I've worked in companies where people's egos would walk in the room half an hour before they did, and the small company environment, you don't get that. So you have to work closely with people, heads of sales, marketing, engineering, in any small company, and develop those relationships and find out what is working for them and what isn't, and not working in silos. You have to be one collective whole. So yes, in my career, I've established very close working relationships with people from all functions.
And I guess, when we talk about marketing, how do you work to support the marketing team and your heads of marketing, etc., to deliver that ROI? What sort of support do you look for from finance to give to those heads of department?
Well, first of all, you've got to provide the usual finance backup in terms of, okay, these are the kind of the overall high level budgets or forecasts that we're setting for this department, and then what are we going to spend it on, is developing a plan as to where those marketing dollars are going to be spent and resourced and allocated to, and then providing feedback on, okay, this is where you are. But that's the old traditional finance stuff. What I'm really looking for from the heads of marketing is the data back. It's the reports on, okay, so how valuable was that campaign? How valuable was that event that we attended? How many leads did we get? And from there, what's our win ratio? So what's our marketing qualified leads to wins ratio? What's our SQL to win ratio? It's very much a data oriented approach that I'm looking for from my marketing function, and then discussing those and then feeding those back.
And I guess finding that balance point where everything aligns.
Exactly right. Yes, and then it's obviously got to feed into sales. So marketing and sales are absolutely interlinked. And in many SaaS companies, they would have a joint sales and marketing VP, for example. I've not worked in that environment. I've had sales where sales and marketing have been distinct.
Yeah.
But it's working with both those leaders to find, okay, are marketing providing enough MQLs to sales? What sales win ratios on those SQLs to everything else? Where we're losing deals, for example, and why we're losing deals. And as CFO, you've got to be inextricably linked with all those data points, really, in order to add value.
Absolutely. And have you, I always find this an interesting question. Obviously, traditionally, when you find challenges in that pipeline between sales and marketing, how do you avoid the finger pointing that can sometimes go when they're two distinct entities? How do you manage that relationship between the two and find a way forward as a group? Marketing saying that, oh, it's the MQLs I've sent over the right ones, and sales saying that they're not quite right. How do you manage those kind of, no, I guess conflicts might be the right word, but how do you manage those challenges?
I think it comes back to the people that you hire in those functions, to be
Yeah.
honest, and the culture that you, as a company, have. We're fortunate at Compleat that we've got an excellent culture. There aren't egos, there isn't finger pointing. There is a kind of, okay, we've got a collective issue here, and how do we solve it? And yes, there is at times in any company, there are times when one function isn't doing sufficient and
Yeah.
is lagging behind or ahead of another function. It's how you then deal with that and the people that you have in the organization and the culture and personality traits that they exhibit in order to deal with those issues. Finger pointing very rarely solves an issue. There has to be accountability and there has to be responsibility. And I've got far more truck and admiration for people who put their hands up and say, you know what, I messed up there. I'm sorry. This is what I've learned from it, and this is how we'll then go forward. The people who exhibit those kind of cultural traits go further in business than the ones who try and hide.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And I think it's quite interesting, isn't it? In smaller businesses, there's people can't hide in, I think in
Mm.
smaller businesses, I think that's one thing that they can get found out really quickly. So we've talked about cash flow, we've talked about sales and marketing being the key growth levers and how finance and you in that CFO role can support that. When you look back over your time as a SaaS CFO, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced?
It's mainly around securing funding. To be honest, because the companies I've been involved with were kind of scaling up at that time. So we've always been, or quite often the companies I've been involved in have been loss making at that time, purely because of the SaaS rules on revenue recognition. So that's always been the major problem, is going back to what we said about forecasting and getting the cash in. So those are the key problems that I've faced in terms of, okay, this is when we're going to need cash, but demonstrating to investors that, no, look, we are growing, we do have the potential here, this is where the product's going, and the product's getting good reviews in the wider sector here. It's then talking to investors as to where some of the issues are, and being realistic about some of the constraints that you're facing and some of the barriers that you have in terms of getting further growth, and carrying that very fine line between giving investors a very positive story without going too far the other way and glossing it up too much and painting too pretty a picture that actually you couldn't realistically defend.
Yeah, I was speaking to one of the to the managing partner of a PE house on a previous episode, and he was saying that's one of the biggest challenges, is that trust is so critical between investor and investee. And he said, it's very easy for that to go wrong.
It is, and at times we've had to go back to investors and said, yeah, we've missed targets.
Yeah.
And you've had to be very honest and say, look, we tried something, we did this, it didn't work, or it didn't work quickly enough. It didn't work at the speed that we thought it would work. And so you've got to maintain relationships with investors where you are honest, but at the same time still trying to garner support, for their continued support for the business. And it is difficult. But ultimately, if you go into investor meetings and spin a falsehood that is too much, you'll get found out.
Yeah.
And so it's better just to be completely honest with your investor base and say, okay, this didn't work, or we haven't gone quickly enough. But conversely, when you then do have some good results, you then are believed in the same vein, and presenting both those in the same light.
So you mentioned you'd had some challenges previously where you hadn't quite hit the targets that you'd anticipated, or something didn't quite go as planned. How did you approach that to try and find, like you said, that balance between investor confidence but also realism and that trust, that trusting relationship?
It's having a plan how to get out of it. It's all very well to go and invest and say, okay, we messed up here, we didn't hit our targets, and if you leave it at that, then you're not giving investors any reason to continue to support the business. You've then got to say, these are the learning points. This is how we're going to do differently. This is the plan for the future. You've then got to present that future vision in a way to encourage them to continue to support the business. I come back to the no surprises policy. I remember one instance in my last company when myself and my CEO went into a meeting with what was effectively a down forecast, but we hadn't trailed that to the investors that we had at that time, and it was a very, very difficult conversation because we hadn't pre-warned them that this was about to happen. I thought my CEO had done it; he hadn't, and so it was a very difficult conversation with two very disgruntled investors at that time. And so I kind of learned from that the no surprises part of the CFO's role is an extraordinarily important one.
And when you look back on that, how would you have approached it differently? Is that just a sort of a conversation prior, or a message to a heads up, or is it a different, more about the fact that it came out of nowhere and they weren't seeing the gradual issue?
Um, it's both of those things. You've got to have that kind of constant communication, and also communication internally. Because, like I say, on that instance, I thought my CEO had done it, and he hadn't.
Mm.
Um, and so it's the constant communication both internally and externally, where you're informing people that is. It was more in that case that the forecast 6 months down the road was very much reduced from what we'd indicated previously, and we hadn't forewarned those two investors sufficiently enough and in time that was about to happen. By the time you come to a board meeting, the board meeting should be a rubber stamp,
Yeah.
in my view. Most of the work in terms of what the messaging is, you need to do beforehand. And in that particular instance, and I'm talking about 12, 13 years ago now, we hadn't.
And do you know what? It's great because I think too often we're happy to talk about the success stories, but very rarely do we talk about all of the lessons learned in our experience. And it's great to hear you share some of those, that history, because I think once you've been in that situation, you never want to be in it again. So
Absolutely. Oh, if you wanted to do a podcast on the mistakes I've made in my career, then I've got about 5 or 6 hours that I could probably share with you. But that was one that stood out, particularly with regard to the SaaS environment. And so ever since then, it's stayed with me.
And you talk, obviously, investors are critical to any SaaS business. And over the years, have you dealt, when you went out for funding, did you always go for the traditional funding route? Was it banks or private equity or VC? What sort of investors have you worked with over your lifespan?
So I've worked with family offices
Mm.
to a good extent. Also, one small pan-European VC, but also with the kind of high net worth community as well.
Mm.
I've sort of worked across that range.
And did you find there were some subtle or not so subtle differences between how, I guess, those investors wanted to be communicated with?
Um, Quite often the high net worths, because they're doing it in terms of what was wanting a return, they will not necessarily pay as much attention as a VC or a family office will.
Mm.
They're just purely looking for a return as to where to put some of their funds and get the tax breaks that come out from that. So you still got to communicate to the high net worths, but often you will find that they just take your updates, your written updates, and not respond. Some will. Some play an active part and will ask questions. Will attend investor meetings, even though they don't necessarily know much about your sector.
Mm.
So they will play interest. Others won't. So on the high net worth, you've got to take both of those at the same time. With others, you've got investors who maybe are involved in fintech and will ask you far more detailed questions. Will ask you details about many of the SaaS metrics that is in the community, and ask you questions. Okay, so your CAC ratios aren't very positive at the moment, Mark. What are you going to do as a company about those? Whereas some of your high net worth investors will not know what that means at all. So you've got to be able to answer questions across the breadth of that, from the one very unsophisticated investor right up to the very sophisticated investor who is completely attuned to your company and understands SaaS extremely well.
So I always find it really hard to explain to people why they should choose ITAS as their financial transformation or Sage partner. So rather than me tell you how awesome we are, I'm going to let our customers do it.
So we decided to go with ITAS because when we were looking for a partner, we felt that they not only took the time to understand our business and they knew the needs of everyone on the team or everyone that would be using the system, but they also were very transparent in kind of what they could do, what they couldn't do. And prior to having us, sign anything or make any agreements, they held meetings with us to walk them through our processes and our business so that they really understood everything that would need to be done and give us realistic timelines as well. And another thing was, because we were so new and we didn't have a current system going, we were looking for something that we could implement rather quickly, but also do it correctly. And we felt that iTask would be able to achieve both of those in terms of, understanding our business and implementing it how we wanted it, but also doing it in our rather quick timeline.
And when you were going out for funding and you were looking for investors for the different organizations you worked with, were there any takeaways or learnings that you particularly gained during that time? Is there, either mistakes or things that you think that went really well that you can share with us?
It's difficult when you've missed targets. I particularly remember one meeting that I had with an investor in my previous company. My CEO decided not decided, but he had to undergo an operation at that time, so he was out of action for 6 weeks. So I went down to London on my own to meet this high net worth individual, big name in a PLC. He was a Sir, so he'd been knighted, and I remember being hauled over the coals for about 20 minutes when he was talking to me about everything that we'd done wrong in that company and me not having an answer. And it was going so badly. I thought I'd blown this. And after 20 minutes of berating me, he turned around and said, "I'm still going to invest. I just wanted to let off some steam." But it was a systematic breakdown of the things where we've gone wrong in the company and what we need to do to put it right. But this is why you then need some of these people in your company, because you need to take on board, because they've been there and done it. They've grown companies. This man was extraordinarily successful, and he kind of gave me a very, very strong commercial lesson in 20 minutes, which I've remembered to this day.
So that's 20 minutes. So what were the key takeaways that you took away from that 20 minutes? What were the key, learnings that you've taken forwards into your future roles?
Oh gosh, be prepared. Be prepared for all kinds of left field questions that you may get asked by investors. Know your numbers. I did have a strong idea of the numbers. This was more about the kind of the strategy, the direction of the company, which is where I really needed my CEO to back me up a little bit. But unfortunately, he was out of action for that day. But it's understanding your business and being able to have a realistic conversation with any investor about the strengths and weaknesses of the entirety of the business.
And you mentioned a few times, obviously, working in tandem with your CEO. So what does a healthy CFO and CEO relationship look like to you?
You're right. It's an absolutely vital one. I've been fortunate enough to work with 2 or 3 very, very good ones. At my last company, I had a Russian CEO, which we had to get over the cultural differences there. That was very interesting from time to time, and we butted heads quite often, but we then came to respect and understand each other's perspective. My current CEO is excellent, very, very good, all-rounded individual, obviously. And you need to have that kind of honest relationship between the two of you, where there are no conversations that are off limits. And you need to be able to spitball into, okay, what if we did this? What if we do that? You need to have the ability to call each other crazy from time to time and say, yeah, I understand where you come from, but it's really not going to work. And then expect that same CEO to come back again and again and say, no, Mark, I know you think it's crazy. I still think it's going to work. and you go back and you say it's crazy again, and then you do that until one or other of you backs down and says, okay, go ahead with your crazy idea, or he turns around and says, yeah, I think you're really right in the end. But it's having that kind of honest relationship where you can talk to each other in those terms and not leave any stone unturned. So you need to be completely on the same page from a cultural perspective, and then have agreement to the strategic direction of the company and where you think it's going to go, and reflect each other's views and take them on board, reflect on them.
And that sounds, from my perspective, that sounds like the ideal relationship. I guess, over the years, when you've hit maybe either a conflict, like you say, you both feel like you are right, but have completely different perspectives. How do you approach that kind of conversation, with your CEO to say, actually, I'm really concerned about this? How do you, I guess, find a way to balance out the growth story with the reality story?
It comes back to the same thing. If you're fully agreed on the strategic direction of the company, you start from that point. And then you sort of then between the two of you then discuss, okay, what are the risks in doing this strategy? What's the kind of the financial consequences of doing this versus not doing it? And then if you're coming from that perspective, you're then getting a kind of an idea of the underlying risks of the business of pursuing something. If you've got something that's high risk, potentially high reward, and is going to cost a lot of money, you spend a lot more time before you go and do it. If actually it's the converse of that, where, okay, I want to try this. If it goes wrong, it's not going to be the death knell of the company. You take a more balanced approach on it. And then agree then the parameters, okay, let's go ahead and do this, but then do we agree there's certain milestones along the way within which we can say, we stop now. It is not working, so we stop. Or conversely, yes, it is working, let's keep going with it.
And you mentioned high risk, high reward investments or direction. How do you approach the risk mitigation in those instances? Are there any examples where you've kind of, you look back and you go, maybe we shouldn't have done that, or I would have approached that differently?
I actually sort of turn full table on this one. It's very traditional for CFOs to be the handbrake on the business, and actually you can hurt the business more by doing that. I am now much more the perspective of it's taking those risks. You've got to try some initiatives in order to see if they work. You don't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And so sometimes you've got to try these and recognize that in order to grow the business, sometimes you have to go a little bit left field. Providing you're having those honest conversations internally, you're putting milestones along the way that is kind of review points. Is it working? Yes or no? Do we stop now? Yes or no? Then that's what I would encourage many CFOs to do, that. Take more risks. Providing they're not reckless risks, but they're done with thought, on a balanced scenario, recognizing when the checkposts and the milestones are on the way. I'd encourage more CFOs to take risks. You look at the successful businesses in the SaaS sector and in business in general, is the ones who have gone into a left field position, who have taken a contrary perspective, who actually achieve the breakthroughs.
Yeah, and I think there is that traditional perception of finance, isn't it? Like they're the no people rather than the go.
And I've never wanted to be seen as that. You want to be seen as the person who says yes, or if it's a no for extremely good reason. And even then, it's understanding and having those conversations internally as to why you're still saying no.
Yeah. And you mentioned the importance of being strategically aligned with your CEO. Have you ever been in a situation where you haven't been strategically aligned? And I guess if so, how did you deal with it?
I think at one company when I first started out as a CFO in 2004, there was a time within my first CEO there where I wasn't. and it was clear that he was going down a road where he hadn't done enough diligence. He was too trusting in the people around him, and I inherited a business with sales target with sales forecasts that were a piece of fiction.
Yeah.
And it was quite clear that unless drastic action was taken at that time, that business may go under. And so we had to take some very radical steps at that time in order to rectify that. So that was a time when, yes, I was out of line with my CEO, and it was a position I inherited, not one that I'd came out over time. It rectified itself quickly, let's just say.
And that must have been incredibly challenging going into a new role and having to kind of pull the secrets out from underneath the mattress and put them into reality. How did you approach that?
It was worrying. Again, it was a small company. We had to go into an immediate retrenchment mode. I had to put in place a redundancy program right before Christmas, which is not my finest moment in my career, and when I look back on fondly, but it was necessary. And we just had to explain to those people affected and the rest of the business why we had to do what we had to do.
Yeah.
It was a necessary action at that time.
Yeah. And would that change, I guess, how you approach a new role? Would you was it within a very short space after starting? Would you have done anything, I guess, differently going into that organization?
It definitely did change me because it would make me do a lot more due diligence on that company in advance. It may not have made much difference in that circumstance, because it was only on doing effectively due diligence whilst in the company and looking at those sales, those sales prospects and where they were down the funnel. And in reality, they were far, far, far earlier in the funnel than the rest of the business had been generally led to believe. So it's made me appreciate that do as much due diligence as you can in advance and have those frank conversations with CEOs or other senior people within the business, and try and do as much more due diligence in advance of joining that company. Assuming you've been offered the role, but you've then got a time once you've been offered a role, I think that's the time where you can do some more of those more searching questions, and strip the company down a little bit more before you accept the offer. So yes, I would. That was a lesson for me in terms of doing a little bit more work in advance of taking a role.
And you mentioned that in one of your roles you worked with a Russian CEO, and you also commented on some of the cultural differences. So tell us a little bit about those. How, was it a big cultural difference, or was it fairly minor?
It could be significant at times, yes. He at times could be very much a micromanager. I am most definitely not. And I saw the negative consequences of that, not necessarily on me, but on other members of the UK team. But over time, we came to understand each other to a great extent. Russians have, what I found with my Russian colleagues, they had very many very positive work attributes, notably their commitment, their work ethic was very strong. What was missing from time to time was the commercial nous, particularly as a lot of our software developers were over there. So we had quite a few difficult conversations with the developers who wanted to go in a way that was using the bright new shiny piece of technology that they wanted to use, rather than to what was actually commercially where the company needs to be and develop the products that the company needed. And so we had some difficult conversations based around commercial naivety versus techies wanted to working with shiny new pieces of software that they wanted to have experience on.
I'm not sure that's limited to Russians, to be very
It's
fair.
not. No, it's It isn't, but then when you're doing it across different language, obviously
Yeah.
languages were a constraint as well. My Russian is not good. Fortunately, many of my Russian colleagues spoke good English or
Yeah.
decent enough English, and we managed to get by.
Yeah. And I guess, when you look back at your career in SaaS, and you've been in it for quite a while now, to be fair. And I think, a lot of people say they want to be in SaaS as a CFO. So when you look back, what were the key things that you think make a successful CFO in SaaS?
Understanding the metrics. SaaS is a different world from an investor perspective in terms of the metrics that are reported on and looked on. You can have a loss-making SaaS company that is highly successful, purely because you're investing at the right time and you're investing in growth levers for the future. And it's been able to articulate those and talk about those and understanding when you then push levers for further investment. And it's a very upside down market in some ways, that you can be loss making and yet still be highly successful and highly sought about and talked about, rather than running a business for profit, which actually SaaS companies generally aren't at that time. It's always the profit will come tomorrow and the prospects are there for tomorrow. So it's understanding the metrics and the levers, which are quite unique to the SaaS sector, that you won't find in many other sectors. I'd be lost in manufacturing, for example. I would have no clue what to do in a manufacturing company. But conversely, a manufacturing-based CFO would be lost in my world in SaaS as well. And further you go on in finance, you realize that you can become quite niche. And whilst there are many crossovers in companies and many things you are talking the same language, I know myself and a manufacturing-based CFO would be talking 50% of the same language and 50% not understanding the other in the slightest.
Yeah. And I certainly, obviously, we work across both of those sectors. And I can tell you that the conversations and the asks that we get from those different CFOs and the metrics that they measure are very different. So it
Yes.
is, you're 100% right. It's almost like they each have their own language. And until you understand it,
That's exactly right. No, I couldn't put it better. Yes.
So we've well, thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your insights today. And I'm going to ask you one final question. To any CFOs that are looking to get into SaaS, what would you say are the key things that they need to think about?
There's an awful lot of material that you can read, I would suggest, about SaaS companies. A lot's been written about it, and it is a relatively new sector to be in compared to many other sectors, to many other industries. So I think there's an awful lot of reading material that you can. It's then talking to SaaS CFOs as well. I'd be more than happy to have anybody contact me and then say, okay, I'm interested in becoming a SaaS CFO. What do I then need to learn about and embrace? And reading materials. It's also having the ability to take a very commercial perspective, because especially in sort of startups and scale-ups, you're loss-making. It's about managing your cash. It's about talking with investors. It's quite exciting in many ways, but you're not entering a comfortable, profitable, cash-generative environment from day one. It's likely to be the converse. It's having the ability to be able to manage with that and think, okay, how can we manage cash carefully over the next month or two in order to get us to where we know the money's going to land? And it's not for everybody. And it can be, it's a bit of a roller coaster, shall we say. So it's about having the ability to cope with that as well, and taking on those character attributes where you can work in a small company successfully with your peers and not be in a comfortable environment. Think, okay, I've got X million in the bank. What am I going to spend it on? Quite often, you will not have that in the bank.
Yeah, and I guess it's getting comfortable with the lack of cash flow, isn't it? And being comfortable with being, non-profit making, which is, like, as you say, it goes against some of the core rules that sometimes
Yes.
we get given in business.
But
So
then when you get that money, when you get that investment and you do have a
yeah,
couple of million in the bank, it's then, okay, how do we spend this wisely?
yeah.
And how are we going to measure the returns from this in terms of sort of the marketing metrics or the sales metrics or your customer service metrics, example?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's a really great insight, because SaaS can sound incredibly exciting, and it is a really exciting industry to be in. And I see it from both sides, both working with SaaS companies, but also being obviously a SaaS company. But like you
Yeah,
said, there's always that double-edged sword to the commercial focus to see if you can if you're comfortable within that space.
that's
So
right. Okay.
well, thank you so much, Mark, for joining me today and for sharing your experience, both your lessons and some of the learnings that you've made over the years as a SaaS CFO. And if our listeners want to learn more about you, more about Compleat and what you guys do, where's the best place to look and to find you?
Sure. And I very much enjoyed this, Hannah. So thank you very much for that. I'm on LinkedIn I think you just Mark Blakemore. I think I'm there. I'm on Twitter, X on @Mark Blakemore. Compleat, you'll find us on CompleatSoftware.com, and we have a world-leading accounts payable and budget to pay automation platform. So if your finance function is in need of increased automation and help on the accounts payable and your invoice processing, we can help you, very much help you.
Fantastic. And for anyone that is listening, don't worry, you don't have to type those links in. We will put them in the show notes to make them nice and easy to access. So thank you again, Mark, for joining me. Thank you to our listeners for dialing in, and we'll see you next time on the CFO 4.0 podcast.
Now, for the £1 million question. What is the best finance software for your business? Is it A, Sage 50? Is it B, Sage 200 Standard? C, Sage 200 Professional? Or D, Sage Intact? An impossible question to answer without a lifeline. But we have the perfect lifeline for you. Our free quiz, which Sage product is right for you? We'll tell you which product is the best fit for your business in just 5 minutes. All you need to do is head to www.itassolutions.co.uk and answer a few simple questions.